In this video, I'll talk about some tips and information that will help make learning the fretboard a lot easier. The first thing you should realize about the guitar is that when you play the guitar, you're not usually thinking about note names. That's an important point because it's more important to be able to figure out notes on the fretboard than to be able to just memorize all the notes. Now, when learning the fretboard, you may think that you have to learn all these notes, and it's a lot of notes to learn, going all the way up to here, and that they're all individual different notes. But there's a lot of patterns that repeat on the guitar. And if you can start to understand those patterns, it makes the task of learning the fretboard a lot more simple. So the first thing that you should realize is that after this 12th fret, all the notes repeat. So this, up to the 12th fret, is a mirror image of this, except once you get beyond this 12th fret, it's an octave higher. So for example, I'll pick a note here. This is F, and this is F, because it's beyond this 12th fret. So this is the E, that's one octave higher than an open E. So if I hit the open string and this note, it's an octave apart. So it repeats after that. So right off the bat, all these notes are going to be just the same as these notes. And so this might still seem like a lot of area to memorize, and it is. So what you have to do is break it down even further. So one thing you should memorize are the E strings. If you are going to commit any string to memory, I would recommend committing the E string to memory. And I say at least one string to memory because you're going to need to know the changes in the notes that occur in music. For example, when you go from an E to an F, that's a half step. But when you go from an F to a G, it's a full step. And in between there is the F sharp and G flat note. So there's a full step there between F and G, a full step between G and A full step between A and B, but then another half step between B and C. And then a full step between C and D, and a full step between D and E. So if you didn't memorize any of the strings, you wouldn't be aware of that pattern perhaps, unless you knew some basics about music. So the first string to memorize would be the E strings. And why? Because you have two of them when you're in standard tuning. These two outside strings are tuned exactly the same, and they're 2 octaves apart. So when you hit them both together, you're playing an E 2 octaves apart. So any of these notes are all the same, 2 octaves apart. So there's an E, D, B, A, G. So right there I've just learned 2 of the strings that I need on this fretboard. Now, yeah, you've committed those 2 strings to memory, but that's a good first step. The next string, if you take a look at, is the A. Okay, you might know that it's an open A string, or you can think about the pattern that this string forms. For example, that note there occurs here on the 6th string. This A is the open 5th string. So with this pattern here can be pasted basically right here. So if you've learned your E string and you know this pattern of notes, now you know this string right here, up to here. And here you get to this note, D. And you can take it all the way up to this E here. And once you get to the E, well, you know from E. There's that pattern. So you have to find the repetitions of where certain strings pick up. Another important relationship that's good to know is the octave. So if you play a note 2 strings below the 6th string and 2 frets forward, it's an octave higher. So if I play the open 6th string and this note here on the 2nd fret of the 4th string, I'm playing an octave. If I do the same thing 1 fret up on both strings, that's an octave. And the note is the same. So there I've learned that this is F. So if I play this shape right there, I'm playing an octave. So now I know this string because I know it in relation to the 6th string. So for example, if I know this is A, I know this note's A right here. If I know this is B, know that's B. So this octave shape applies. No matter where you move it, it applies. So you know all these notes here on this 4th string. So on this 4th string here, the only note that you can't play the octave with is this note, but it's right in back of this note. So this note you know is E now, because it's an octave with the top string. So what's 1 in back of E? Here's your other E that you know on the 6th string. There you go, it's D sharp or E flat. So you know that this note here is D sharp or E flat. And you should know the open strings. So you know that's open D. And so the same pattern applies with the next open string. For example, this is D, and your 4th string is D, because the pattern that we talked about with the E to the A repeats from the A to the D. So these notes that are on the A are the same as these notes on the D. So you should realize that pattern that's taking place. And then that octave rule applies again. So if you have the open A, open 5th string, this 2nd fret note here on the 3rd string is an octave. So the octave applies once again. So if you can figure out that this is E, then you know that this is E here on the 3rd string. Or in reverse, if I point to a note here, you can back it down to that note, which you now know is F. Because that note is right in front of E, and you know that right in front of E are Fs. So you can always reference back to the string that you know to figure out the notes of the strings that you don't know yet. Now the next little shape that you can play is the octave between the 4th string and the 2nd string. What you do is you extend it out 1. So you're playing, if you play a note on the 4th string, down 2 strings and up 3 frets is an octave. So you can figure out the notes on the 2nd string with that method, because now you have a method to figure out the notes on the 4th string. So what you do is you use the method to figure out the note on the 4th string and then translate that to the note on the 2nd string. For example, say I wanted to know this note here on the 2nd string. Well, if I make an octave, I know that this note is the same. And this note is the same as that note, because I made an octave. There's an octave lower, and there's another octave lower. So I know that's A, because I know my 6th string. And that's how I can learn the notes on this string. So I'll pick one more here. How about that one? If I take that note there, bring it down an octave, bring it down an octave, that's an F sharp. So there's my octave, and there's my octave, and there's my F sharp. And I can confirm it in another way. So for example, that's an E. I can do E, F, F sharp. E, F, F sharp. So it's all about relationships when figuring out these notes. It's not like you have to memorize every single note on the neck of the guitar. What you do is you start filling in, and you'll see is the more you play, you'll have hot spots where you'll know the notes a little better than other spots. And eventually you'll be able to point to a note and know what the note is without thinking about it, without going through this step of kind of like translating it back to a string you know, because you'll become more familiar with the strings that are less familiar to you now. So let me just go over some of these octave shapes real quick so you can use them as a tool. There's an octave from the 1st to the 3rd string. It's 2 strings apart and 3 frets apart. Same as from 2nd to 4. You go 2 strings apart and 3 frets apart. Now when you want to go from 3 to 5, it's 2 strings apart and 2 frets apart. Same when you go from 4 to 6. It's 2 strings apart and 2 frets apart. And now you have other shapes like this going from 4 to 1. It's 3 strings apart and 2 frets apart. And when you go from 5 to 2, it's the same shape moved up 1. So it's 3 strings apart and 2 frets apart. And then you have this shape here when you go from 6 to 3, which is also 3 strings apart and also 3 frets apart. So these are your octave shapes. You also have a couple more that are more of a reach. For example, you can go from 3rd string to 2nd string. So it's 1 string apart but 4 frets apart. And then you have this kind of a reach right here. This is 1 string apart, 5 frets apart. It's kind of impractical to use that one. That's the same thing right there. If you want to work on your stretching, go for it.